Good day and welcome to Elephant Woodworking. I'm Lawrence, and in this video I'm building a classic rectangular blackwood coffee table using only entry-level tools. No planer, no joiner, no track saw, just smart workarounds and a few jigs. I started with the tabletop build, and this is where buying S4S boards really pays off. Since I don't own a planer or joiner, starting with boards that are already surfaced on all four sides saves a massive amount of setup and time. These are 25mm thick South African blackwood boards, and I ripped them down to 175mm wide using my Bosch contractor saw. Nothing fancy here, just slow and steady cuts and paying attention to consistency. To laminate the tabletop, I used my Ryobi biscuit joiner with 10mm biscuits. Biscuits don't magically fix bad joints, but they're great for alignment, especially when you don't have perfectly joined edges. They keep everything flush during glue up, which means way less sanding later. Once the glue was dry, I cleaned up the seams with a belt sander. The key here is patience. Let the tool do the work and don't chase perfection or too aggressively, otherwise you will mess up your workpiece. To trim the top to the final length, I used my Ryobi circular saw with a plywood straight edge jig. I don't own a track saw, and honestly, this works surprisingly well. A straight piece of ply and a couple of clamps can get you clean, accurate cuts without spending a fortune. After trimming the tabletop to final length, I moved on to finish sanding. I used my Bosch Orbital sander, starting at 80 grit and then working my way through 120 and finally finishing at 240 grit. With the top sanded smooth, I added the edge detail using my Ryobi router. Nothing too aggressive, just enough to soften the edges and make the top feel good to the touch. Small details like this make a big difference in how a finished piece looks and feels. For the legs, I started by ripping 80mm wide strips on my table saw. This is slightly oversized at the moment, but allows me to come back and square everything up, which you will see a bit later in the process. Once the strips were cut, I trimmed them down to about 450mm long using my Ryobi Mitre saw. Doing this before glue up just makes everything easier to handle and keeps the clamps under control. Each leg is made by laminating 3 25 by 80mm boards together. Laminating like this is a great option when you don't have thick stock available. Once the glue was dry, I milled each blank back down to a 75 by 75mm square leg on the table saw. After the legs were all squared up, I trimmed them down to the final length of about 420mm using my Mitre saw. Doing this after everything is square just helps to ensure all 4 legs are exactly the same length and avoids any surprises later. Because my Mitre saw isn't quite big enough to cut all the way through, I finished the cut using a handsaw. After the legs were trimmed down, I sanded them back to 120 grit just to clean everything up and expose any imperfections. After sanding, I filled any small exposed gaps using a mixture of sawdust and superglue. It's a simple fix, but it really helps tidy things up and makes a big difference once finish is applied. With the sanding and filling done, I softened all the edges on my small routed table using a round over bit. This is a small detail, but it completely changes how the table looks and feels. Moving on to the frame and joinery, I started by ripping 70mm wide strips on my table saw to make up the frame. I then trimmed the strips down to their final length just to get all the frame pieces sized and ready before moving on to the joinery. Now for the fun part, the castle joints. A castle joint is basically an interlocking joint where the leg and frame slots into each other. It gives you a lot of glue surface and built-in strength, which makes it a great choice for tables, but it also means everything has to line up perfectly. I started by mortising out the slots in the center of the top of each of the legs for the frame to eventually slot into. These mortises run in both directions perpendicular to each other and are the same thickness in depth as the frame pieces, which helps ensure a tight flush fit. Taking your time here is crucial if you want everything to come together cleanly on later. I then moved on to mortising out the interlocking slots on both ends of the frame pieces. These slots are cut to half the frame width, about 35 mm, so that when the two perpendicular frame pieces hook together, they slot seamlessly into the leg and sits flush with the top of the leg. Finally, it was time for the glue up, and honestly, this was by far the most stressful stage of the entire build. I started by adding glue into the mortar section of one of the legs before slotting in one of the shorter frame pieces with the hook facing upwards. I then used the rubber mallet to gently tap it into place, just making sure everything is seated properly. From there, I added more glue to the hooked section of the frame piece in the leg assembly, before slotting in a longer perpendicular frame piece, making sure the hooks were fully seated and flush in the center. I continued this process, working my way counterclockwise, adding glue, slotting pieces together and tapping everything home until all the frame pieces were hooked together and seated into the legs. It was a bit of a race against the clock. Lots of parts, lots of glue and not much room for hesitation. But once everything was seated, it was a huge relief to see it all finally come together. After the glue up, I set the entire frame and leg assembly back to 240 grit, making sure there were no glue marks or screws out left from the assembly process, because any of that would immediately show up once the finish is applied. To attach the tabletop to the frame and leg assembly, I decided to use Z-clips. I cut slots into the frame using my Biscuit joiner. Seating the Z-clips into these slots allows the tabletop to move naturally with seasonal wood movement. I then attached the tabletop to the frame and leg assembly by marking out the positions of the Z-clips on the other side of the tabletop. I then drilled small pilot holes to secure everything in place with screws. Finally, it was time for finish. I used Woodoc 10, which is a polyurethane and wax blend. It goes on easily and leaves a really smooth, almost velvet-like finish, and this is where the blackwood really comes to life. I applied 3 coats, lightly sanding with steel wool between each coat to ensure a smooth, consistent final finish. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this project, please give the video a like and consider subscribing. Please drop a comment if you've got any questions or ideas for future projects.